This is Deepa Parekh with Dr. Paul Wagner. We are continuing our conversation on ethics and leadership. Today's focus is on the pragmatic value of justice for all. Dr. Wagner, I have a question regarding that. So, what is justice, and how are justice and promising related?
Well, you really can't talk about justice without introducing the two most famous scholars of justice in the past 70 years. One is John Rawls, who was at Harvard. In fact, Barack Obama said that Rawls had more influence on his thinking than any other professor. And the other one is a fellow by the name of Amartya Sen, who is, as you may recognize the name, is from India, and he was a Nobel Prize winner in economics, and he had a joint appointment in economics and philosophy at Harvard, but he preferred to stay in the philosophy department. Anyway, John Rawls gives us an idea of how to imagine justice. So imagine a situation where you're going to be with a group of people, and you don't know what role you'll have in that community. So now you're going to try to imagine how should the rewards and risks of the community be distributed to in such a way that everyone will have the most fair opportunity to enjoy participation in a community with the least amount of risk. Now, again, you remember, you're imagining you don't know who you'll be in this community. It's like a set of open chairs, and you're going to make up the rules, and then you go in and sit down. But you don't get to choose the seat that you'll have. They're chosen for you at random. So it's called a veil of ignorance. And using this veil of ignorance, you come up with whatever rules or social conventions that you figure will create the most conducive situation to community well-being. Rawls was very happy on having a capitalistic system and knowing what we know about human beings. Human beings seek out rewards and so on. And, if we can convince the people of sure hands and great intellect to go into neurosurgery instead of gardening, that's to the advantage of everyone in the community. And we want to draw them into that role rather than some other role. Now, by the same token, none of us in this imaginary mirror of ignorance, none of us is going to want to take a chance that we might fall between the cracks and suffer or die in a community because the rules that were made up allow for some people to be disposable. So we don't want to have any disposable people. And so you have to have a safety net, according to Rawls, so that everyone, regardless of what happens to them, whatever misfortune may come their way, they're not going to be allowed to just slide between the cracks and disappear altogether. And so that was Rawls telling us about a veil of ignorance. I said mirror before, I meant veil of ignorance, how we can use the veil of ignorance to come up with a concept of justice that would help us understand what we should do in any organization that we want to be just and fair. Now, his academic colleague, Amartya Sen, came along and is the other well known figure in the past 70 years in theory of justice. And one of the things that Sen did was give us more mathematically apt ways of narrowing the range between those who need that net and those who are at the top. I mean, how much reward do you have to give at the top to bring the best people into that? Do you really want to just leave it willy-nilly, where you can make as much as you possibly can? Will that serve the community the best? You might ask yourself questions like this. Who serves the community the best? Our Nobel laureates in sciences or our movie actors and athletes? When you remember, I used the word meta language to talk about budgets and accounting in schools. Where you put your money, regardless of what you say, where you put your money is what you really value. And are we in a society where we value entertainment more than we value health practice and finance and legal scholars and so on and so forth? If we really did value the uh, those who can make society better for all, then the salaries ought to be different in favor of those scholars that you want to attract in that direction than using that money to get bigger and better athletes or actors. Now, we're not saying actors and athletes are disposable, that they're not important. Sure, we like to have them, we like to watch them. But where should we put society's rewards to best advantage society? And that's the kind of thing that SEN added to the work of John Rawls. So in justice, we have these intellectual constructs that help us imagine what a just society should look like. But there's one more thing that should be added to it, and that is, and Rawls picked up on it. He wrote an essay one time called A Sense of Justice. It seems that there's a feel that has to go with this all too, that ordinary people recognize when somebody is being treated unjustly. We do have a feel for that. Now, we may try to blunt that feeling if we have become self-interested and saying we just want things to work out in any way that'll advantage us. But even if we try to think that way, we're going to have to work really hard to blunt our natural reaction to seeing someone treated unjustly. When you read about human trafficking in different parts of the world or even in our own nation, you'd have to be a fairly jaundiced personality not to feel your heartstrings being pulled upon when you imagine um, the uh, the terror and the wrongness of what happens to those who are victims of human trafficking. So there's that sense of justice. We want to be just. That's really important. For Rawls, there's got to be that wanting to be just, and he thinks we're born with it. The psychologist Paul Bloom at Yale has a lot of evidence that indicates we come right into this world with already having a sense of sympathy and perhaps empathy for others. And Alison Gopnik, psychologist, developmental psychologist at Harvard, has also acquired evidence that makes it look like we do come to this world with that sense of sympathy and empathy for others. And that might be what Rawls means by a sense of feel of justice that has to be a part of the package as well. So in our schools, we want to have schools that reflect a sense of justice. What do we want to reward? I think what we want to reward is success within the great conversation of humankind. I don't think we want to reward the toughest kid on the school bus who bullies the others. I'm not sure there's much advantage to rewarding somebody for athletic performance. We don't want to make light of it. But to what extent does that athletic performance contribute to the athlete and to everyone else's participation in the great conversation of humankind? That great conversation of humankind should be that city on the hill that we're inviting everybody up to. And that city on the hill has to be constituted of a sense of justice by everyone who enters.
Wow. So, following question, how do you sustain and elevate a properly working moral architecture?
Well, first of all, those who are the leaders of the great conversation of humankind, those who make the invitation to enter, that is to say, our school teachers, and one would hope our political leaders and anybody who's on TV, it certainly has an opportunity to help out teachers in this domain, should role model a concern for cooperation. Remember, we talked about there being this pyramid, this moral pyramid. Morality is about this pyramid. And so they should reflect a concern for the foundation. The foundation is cooperation. And at the heart of that is the concept of promising. And just above that, we have our virtues. And from those virtues, we start coming up with certain um, basic moral rules like do not murder, do not enslave others. And so we find ourselves moving up that pyramid. And we get to lesser moral rules, such as you really shouldn't cheat on exams, and you really shouldn't make fun of other people because they look different from you. Then we get further up into social conventions and uh, rules of etiquette. And then at the very top, we have the smallest rules of etiquette, but they're very important because they speak to what do the people on top really try to embody. And so we have the please and thank you, the namases, the sorts of things, little practices that says the person on the top embodies everything in that pyramid. And so others will presumably want to follow that. And that's what sustains um, the, uh, the moral architecture. And what helps elevate it further is that within the great conversation of humankind, one of the things we're always willing to talk about is how can we do better in learning how we ought to treat one another? That question and that conversation will always be a part of the great conversation of humankind because we can always do a little bit better if only we figure it out. And that will take forever, but we'll make advance. But we'll always have to carry that conversation on.
So how can justice be pragmatic concept? Is that even possible?
No, sure. You go back to the veil of ignorance. One of the values of what Rawls came up with was that he gave us this way of visualizing what we'd all want, whether we were altruistic or not. I mean, his veil of ignorance works for the self-interested person as much as it does for the altruistic person, and all the evidence we have is that 99% of the people have an instinct for both self-interest and for altruism. 1% of the people psychologists identify as having some degree of sociopath. But for Rawls, he would say, you know what, makes no difference how much of either of these instincts any person has. When you think of the veil of ignorance, it makes sense to everybody. I want to have a distribution of rewards, sanctions, punishments, good things and bad things in such a way that there's ample opportunity for me and everybody who walks into that community if we don't know what chair are we going to get to sit at. So we want to construct an environment so that after the dice are rolled and we find ourselves sitting in some chair in that community, we're thinking this is an okay community to be in. And that also is going to underscore how important it is to have that safety net too, so that we don't let um, anybody fall apart. Right now, as we're doing this taping, there's a rush around the world to create a vaccine for COVID. Oh, I've got something I'd like to read you all if I can. I want to talk about this, but finding a vaccine for COVID. And so once we find the vaccine, how quickly will we be able to put that vaccine to work and serve the world's population? Does it go to the rich people first? Does it go to old people first? Does it go to health practitioners first? How do you decide? And we've become kind of jaded in our look at the creation of a vaccine. Some people in our country today may not even want to take it. There's the anti-vaxxer movement, and other people may want to say, "I want me first." And we also think that technology just kind of owes it to us to crank this thing out, and we're going to resent that they'll make a lot of money off of it. Conspiracy theorists may even think, it's been created so that somebody can make a lot of money off it. I want to read a quick passage to you from a book called Why We're Wrong About Nearly Everything. And it's by a statistician. The book just came out. And he tells this story. He said it's April 12th, 1955, 10 years to the day from the death of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, the world's most famous polio victim. This is at the University of Michigan, waiting to hear the results of Dr. Jonas Salk's trial of a polio vaccine. 500 people were in the room, 150 journalists. And the announcements are being relayed to 54,000 physicians around the country. People are listening. Paul Offit, who was a very famous vaccine scientist at the University of Michigan, wrote the following. He said, Salk's presentation was numbing, but the results were clear. The vaccine worked. It didn't just work for rich people or poor people, it worked for people, us. And inside the auditorium, Americans were crying, and they joyfully embraced one another. Church bells began ringing across the country. Factories called for moments of silence to honor this breakthrough. Synagogues and churches were holding prayer meetings, and parents and teachers were weeping in front of their families and in front of their classrooms. It was as if a war had ended. Salk received the gold medal from President Eisenhower in 1985, from President Eisenhower, and in 1985, Ronald Reagan declared the country should celebrate Jonas Salk Day. Journalists asked him, who owns the patent? And Salk responded, is there a patent on the rays of the sun? He said, all I did was what a doctor is supposed to do. I figured out a way to help people. And this vaccine belongs to the people, if only they'll use it. And of course, if they did use it, and up until about 10, 15 years ago, when the anti-vaxxer movement started corroding our fight with nature, polio was about to be extinct, was extinct in this country. And because of the anti-vaxxer movement, polio has started making a comeback in certain parts of the world because of that anti-vaxxer movement. But in any case, one of the things that Rawls' veil of ignorance would have us attend to, what's that safety net? And how do we decide that we've got a world that is optimally just? And we'll always have to think our way through that again. And the rewards, the risks should be distributed fairly. People often talk about, oh yeah, it's really important to distribute the risks fairly. But we forget that it's just as important to distribute the risks fairly. Think of an ordinary classroom, and we want every student to have an optimal opportunity to learn. Now, let's say in a particular class, you have a student who is very lively. And because of 94-142, he has to be in a regular classroom. And he's kind of borderline on whether he could be put in a special ed classroom. And so if he's on the borderline, he's going to stay in that regular classroom. Now, the teacher's got to decide, where do I have this child sit? If I have him sit with 2 or 3 other somewhat rambunctious students, there's going to be pandemonium in that part of the classroom. If I put him over and surround him with the 3 nicest, sweetest little girls who always raise their hand when they want to talk and so on, and are very good students, well, he's going to disturb them, isn't he? And so what right does a teacher have to corrupt the learning experience of those 3 little girls that she may use to surround this child with, thinking that by surrounding him with these 3 children, it will diminish his interrupting the class as a whole, but you're achieving that at the expense of these 3 girls. I don't know what the right answer is to that question, but my example is only to reveal that when we're talking about that safety net that we need in every organization, We're talking about distributing not just rewards. We're also talking about distributing risks. With the vaccine, we're talking about, who do we give the vaccine to? You're distributing both risks and rewards. The person who gets the vaccine first is getting a reward, are they not? And so we pretty much around the world, we say, let's give the vaccine first to our health workers because they're right in the middle of the war against this pandemic. But beyond that, who do we give them to? Do we give them to the old people who are more likely to suffer and die from getting the COVID-19? Or should we give them to the children? Because the children seem to be the super carriers. And so do you fight the virus by attacking where it's most likely to gain its mobility among the population? Or do you fight the virus by giving the first vaccines then to simply those who are most likely to expire should they catch the virus? Difficult questions, but it's all about distributing rewards and risks.
Wow. So, how then do the pragmatics of justice influence education?
Well, because it seems that when you look at how practical this sort of thinking about justice is, it shows you that uh, uh, when we can't be absolutely certain of our knowledge, that our knowledge, I should say, aligns with truth, we go with our best approximation. And that's what pragmatism is all about. Remember, pragmatism never denied that there's truth. The great pragmatists throughout history have always recognized that there's truth, and truth lies outside of our head, not inside the turbulence of our heads. And knowledge is inside that turbulence. But knowledge is that privileged set of beliefs and skills that extends our reach to approximate what's out there, the truth. And so a pragmatic approach to justice is saying, we can't guarantee a perfect world, but using something like Rawls' veil of ignorance, can't we come up with the most approximate distribution of rewards and risks that will be in the likely best interest of everyone in the community? And that's the way we try to think about it.
So, Dr. Wagner, what about in case of vocational education, right? How are they seen in higher education as injustice to society or unequal, or how
That's a
can
great question. You're looking at all these books around here, and so you think, well, this guy lives in essentially a library, and he's reading books all the time, and that would be true. But I also had a ranch for 20 years, and I had neighbors who never got beyond the sixth grade. But when I needed to know how to protect my branch from wild boars tearing up the land, from bobcats, we had a lot of bobcats around, from getting to my dogs, those books behind me, they weren't going to be of any help at all. My neighbor, who never got beyond the sixth grade but had lived his whole life out in that part of the country, was of great help. And one of the things that we have overlooked in recent years, I think, is just the pure dignity of work. And something goes wrong with my plumbing, I'm really not going to start reading books on plumbing to try to figure out and get it done. Maybe I could, I don't know. But I call a plumber. I'm most thankful there's somebody that comes out and is willing to put his hands in and do all sorts of work that I would never want to do, and yet he will do it. Um, should people, in distributing our rewards, should people get more because they have rarer talents than others? And I used the example of a neurosurgeon before. Yeah, again, we do want to do that, but we should never do it at such a cost that we deprive the persons at the other end of a sense of human dignity. So not only do we have that welfare net so no one falls through it, but there ought to be this commitment to the dignity of each and every person. You know, when Mao Zedong, and I'm certainly not a communist, but when Mao Zedong took over China and he was going to make it a truly Lenin-esque Marxist state, one of the things that he wanted to do, he took a lot of wealthy people and they had to work out on farms. Let me stick with my type of people. He went to universities and he made professors go out and work in the fields, and then they can go back to the next season, and then go back and do their professoring. And I'm not sure that would be a bad idea because, in my case, I know I learned a lot from working on my ranch, and I learned a lot from going to graduate school and from continuing to read this stuff. I don't know that I would be all in favor of putting professors to work for several years and then putting them back in to the university. But I see no reason at all why, when you sign up, you get a contract at a university to teach for a year, that 2 months of that may not involve doing grounds work around the university or doing janitorial work around the university. That might encourage everyone to remember everybody that works there deserves a fair amount of dignity.
True. Because without all of us contributing, we will not be able to function as a society.
Right.
And I remember you said that during our summer lectures that 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 respect, when we had uh, our lecture on respect, every person or everyone, you mentioned this, but it's easily forgotten in our day-to-day interactions with people. I'm not sure if it's the stress that we have nowadays than before.
I don't know. I way back when you were just a twinkle in your parents' eyes, I was, probably already in graduate school. But back when I was a kid, um, we were always taught to have respect for most social roles: policemen, firemen, military, clergy, regardless of the faith. And we were taught to say yes, sir, no, sir, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. And one of the things that I think we have lost, in part because of the media and an explosion of folks encouraging us to always act out of self-interest, we too many of us see ourselves as above the police officers, and yet, folks, the next time you're in an alleyway and there's some bad people there to do some really horrible things to you, try calling for a professor or a journalist. I don't think it's going to help you much. The people that we need in those situations are our trained policemen. When we have an accident happen around our home or whatever, we need the EMTs, some kind of first responders. Right now, again, as we're doing this very conversation, um, Houston is waiting for the possibility of another hurricane coming in just 2 or 3 days. And if that hurricane comes and people are isolated in their homes and they have no power, you know who it's going to be that's going to help them out? It'll be the policemen and the firemen. Um, there may even be, in the last big uh, hurricane type of situation Houston had, there was something called the Cajun Navy. And that was a bunch of people from the swamps of Louisiana that hooked up their boats to the back of their pickup trucks, and over 100 of them drove to Houston, parked those pickup trucks, got in those boats, and went around Houston and picked up people who were isolated and brought them to safety. Those are darn good people. And I've got a hunch those people weren't necessarily coming from the top of the economic pecking order. They were good people.
It's very when hard times like these come, natural disasters or anything like that, even with Corona, we see so much good come out in people, or it's always there, but it's just more visible when things like this happen.
There is a experimental school in Houston. I don't know if it's still operating or not, but I remember this a number of years ago. It was a wonderful school. I think it's called Rogers Elementary School. And it was a combination of students who were gifted and students who were physically handicapped. And they deliberately put them together so that essentially every gifted student was also assigned a physically handicapped student as their partner throughout the year. And there were signs everywhere in that school about respect others and, you are your brother's keeper and so on. And it was amazing at how many of those gifted students really took seriously their responsibility toward the physically handicapped. And it was also interesting to see that the physically handicapped so often didn't see themselves as compromised as I had seen kids of that sort act in the past. They interacted with their peers, both gifted and other handicapped students, equally. It was a neat place to be, and it gave you that idea that we should be here together. Back in the Middle Ages in Europe, there was a concept called noblesse oblige, one of those Latin phrases. And what it meant was that if you were born into the nobility, you had a responsibility to take care of those who were lesser than you. And that concept of noblesse oblige had even carried over into great universities in England, such as Cambridge and Oxford, and over here to this country in the 8 Ivy League schools and elsewhere, where the students knew they were privileged. They knew that getting a degree from Harvard was going to mean this world is going to open up lots of doors to you because you're walking out of Harvard with a degree and all the associations you made while you were in that university. So as a result, since you're in a country that made that possible for you, you owe that country a whole lot in return. It's not all about how special you were that led to where you are right now in life, but it's because the country that you happen to be in had a school like a Harvard or in England, a Cambridge or whatever, that made it possible for you to enjoy all the rewards you enjoy. Now you have the responsibility. There's that implicit network of promising. You now have that responsibility, that noblesse oblige, to pay back and to take care of those who are less fortunate than you. One little anecdote along those lines. A couple of years ago, I had gotten a nice new car, nifty car. It's around Thanksgiving time. Cold, very cold, and I went to a Circle K to get something to eat or drink or whatever. And there was a homeless guy sitting over in the corner outside the store. He wasn't asking for anything. I was in a good mood when I came out. That was just a good day for me. Cold, but a good day for me. I saw him over there, and I walked over and I sitting on the ground, and I gave him a $50 bill. He was surprised, and he said, "I wasn't even asking for anything." And I said, "I know if you were, I probably wouldn't have given you anything." And he said, "Okay, thank you." I'm walking back to my car, and I was happy that I had done that for him because I'd done it out of the goodness of my heart, and I was feeling good. But then it dawned on me there's something peculiar about all this because it's not like I earned what I have or he earned what he has. In each case, we won lotteries. I don't know if it was a genetic lottery. I certainly didn't earn my parents. So if my parents or their genes contributed to whoever I became, I didn't earn it. And if his parents contributed to the genes that led to him being in that corner outside the store freezing, he didn't earn that either. He just wound up there. It was just a historical accident for both of us. If it was because of our social and cultural backgrounds, I didn't earn that either. I just wound up where I wound up. And if his social and cultural backgrounds contributed to where he wound up, he didn't earn that either. It just happened to him. And so I started worrying about this as I'm about to get in the car, and I'm thinking, I sure hope I haven't humiliated him by giving him, that amount of money. And in this situation, as he said, wasn't even asking for anything, but he certainly needed it, and he was happy when he got it. And so I thought I needed to do more. I needed to make sure I didn't deprive him of his self-respect. So now what I'm about to tell you has nothing to do with whether I'm religious or not. It would be a good idea even if I were an atheist. So don't think that my finishing the story indicates anything about religious commitment or not. As I'm about to get to the car, I called over to him and I said, "Hey, buddy, could you do me a favor?" And he said, "Well, yeah." And he started getting up. And I said, "Oh, you don't need to get up." I said, "Will you pray for me?" And he said, "Well, yeah, sure." And I said, "Okay, thank you." And I got in my car and I drove off. Now, my thinking behind that was, I'll never know whether he prayed for me or not, but I asked him a favor. That means I empowered him because he doesn't have to grant me that favor or not. And even though he said he would, he's still in control whether he does so or not. And he's got nothing to lose if he reneges on his promise. If he follows through on his promise, he's empowered to do that. And presumably he would feel good about doing that. And so what happened between the two of us, we each gave each other something. And so I hate to tell the story in one sense because it takes something away from actually sharing it. But by the other token, it does illustrate how important it is not to cripple somebody with gifts, but to share with them in a way that helps them and you recognize that we're all truly in this together, and there will always be unequal distributions of rewards and risks, but we're not going to let anybody fall through the cracks. And we're not going to let any of us think that we're so much better than everybody else that we're almost a different species. We're not. That type of thinking begins in kindergarten, and we should continue that throughout all of education into graduate school and medical school and law school. That's part of the path to the great conversation of humankind.
Wow, that was profound. With that, we end our focus on pragmatic values of justice for all. Thank you, Dr. Wagner.